the Black Death. In October 1347, 12 merchant ships arrived at the Sicilian port of Messina after months at sea. As the locals gathered to unload goods, they were met with horror. Most of the crew were already dead. The few who survived were delirious, covered in black, swollen boils, their bodies oozing pus and blood. Within hours, the harbor was sealed, but the infection had already breached containment. What followed would erase a third of Europe's population. The disease moved like fire through dry fields. Within a year, it reached France, Spain, and the British Isles. In cities, carts rolled through streets collecting corpses, stacked 5 or 6 high. Entire families were found lifeless in their homes. Graveyards overflowed. With no time for proper burials, mass pits were dug. The air grew heavy with rot. In London, it was said the dead outnumbered the living. What set this plague apart was its speed and mystery. Victims developed fever, chills, and painful buboes, lumps in the armpits, neck, and groin. Within 2 or 3 days, many died gasping for air, bleeding internally. Some suffered neurological symptoms, lashing out or babbling before collapsing. Physicians were powerless. Remedies ranged from bloodletting to inhaling crushed emeralds. Nothing worked. Historians widely believe the cause was Yersinia pestis, a bacterium carried by fleas on black rats. But this assumption has long been questioned. The Black Death spread far faster than typical bubonic plague and affected regions with no known rat populations. In some areas, victims died within 24 hours, suggesting an airborne or even hemorrhagic strain. Modern DNA analysis from plague pits in London and Bavaria has revealed inconsistencies with modern Yersinia outbreaks. Where it began is equally unclear. Some accounts trace its path from the east, possibly Central Asia, moving along Silk Road routes and arriving at Crimean ports. The Mongol siege of Kaffa in 1346 is often cited, where infected corpses were hurled over the city walls, potentially unleashing the pathogen into Genoese ships fleeing westward. But even this remains speculation, and no definitive patient zero has ever been identified. The societal impact was unlike anything in recorded history. Feudal economies collapsed as laborers died in the fields. Nobles fled cities, clergy perished in droves, and the Catholic Church lost its authority in the eyes of many. Panic bred superstition. Some blamed lepers, others blamed the stars. In Strasbourg, over 2,000 Jews were burned alive in a desperate search for scapegoats. And yet, from devastation came transformation. Wages rose due to labor shortages. Medicine shifted from religious to observational methods. Artistic depictions of death became central to European consciousness. A continent was permanently reshaped by invisible microbes. But one question still haunts epidemiologists. Why did it vanish? The Black Death disappeared from most of Europe by the 1350s, only to return sporadically in later centuries with this diminished intensity. No one fully understands why the original outbreak was so lethal, so fast, and so unique. Was it a genetic mutation that burned itself out? A perfect storm of climate, war, and trade? Or did something far more complex occur, something we still cannot model with today's tools? Over 600 years later, the plague remains a riddle, not because we don't know what happened, but because we still don't fully understand why it happened that way. For an event that killed tens of millions, too many variables remain open, too many mechanisms undefined. The ships arrived in Messina with death in their hulls, but what came ashore was more than a disease. It was a silence that still echoes through the bones beneath Europe's oldest cemeteries. The American Great Dying. In 1519, Spanish ships led by Hernán Cortés landed on the shores of what is now Mexico. With fewer than 1,000 men, they ventured into the heart of the Aztec Empire, a civilization of millions, complete with massive stone cities, sophisticated agriculture, and complex social systems. Within just a few years, it wasn't warfare or weapons that collapsed this empire. It was something far more insidious, an invisible force that swept through an entire continent: disease. What followed is known today as the Great Dying, the most catastrophic depopulation event in recorded history. By some estimates, over 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died between the early 1500s and the early 1600s. Entire civilizations vanished. In less than a century, regions once densely populated with cities, road networks, and farmland became silent forests again. Eyewitnesses from the era wrote of villages where half the people were dead, with corpses lying unburied, scavenged by animals. Spanish friars, often the only literate observers in remote regions, described the horror: sudden fevers, bleeding from the nose and ears, vomiting black bile. In many cases, the disease seemed to kill within days of the first symptoms. And it did not spare. Chiefs, priests, children, warriors, all fell in equal measure. One Franciscan missionary wrote that, "A great many Indians died. Some said it was more than half the population, and they died without help, for there was no one left to care for the sick." But what was the disease? There is no single answer. Smallpox is the most frequently cited culprit, introduced from Europe. It undeniably ravaged central Mexico and the Caribbean. But not all outbreaks match the symptoms of smallpox. Some waves of illness, like the infamous Cocoliztli Epidemics of 1545 and 1576, caused sudden death with extreme dehydration, internal bleeding, and neurological symptoms. The indigenous Nahua word Cocoliztli meant pestilence or great sickness, yet the precise pathogen behind it remains unidentified. Modern research using ancient DNA has failed to isolate a known virus or bacterium responsible for these specific epidemics. Some scientists suggest it may have been a hemorrhagic fever native to the Americas, exacerbated by climate shifts and nutritional collapse following colonization. Drought conditions linked to megadroughts in the 16th century could have weakened immune systems and created ideal conditions for viral mutation. Beyond the physical devastation, the cultural consequences were immeasurable. Oral traditions were lost as entire lineages were extinguished. Monumental architecture was left abandoned. Temples fell silent, and languages ceased to be spoken. To outsiders, this vanishing was seen as a mystery. To survivors, it was the apocalypse. The speed and scale of the die-off were so complete that it reshaped the Earth's atmosphere. Recent climate studies suggest that the depopulation of the Americas contributed to a measurable drop in global carbon dioxide levels. With fewer people to farm and burn forests, vegetation reclaimed massive areas. This rewilding effect may have contributed to the global cooling trend known as the Little Ice Age. The question remains, did this outbreak originate from European contact alone, or were there native pathogens already present, dormant until environmental and social stress brought them to the surface? Some accounts suggest early signs of sickness even before full-scale colonial occupation. Others hint at multiple overlapping diseases, spreading along trade routes that predated European arrival. Despite centuries of study, no single explanation accounts for the vast and varied symptoms, nor the nearly total collapse of indigenous populations. Unlike the Black Death, the Great Dying left no central city to excavate, no single mass grave, no detailed chroniclers among the native peoples themselves. Its records are fragments, written in the margins of conquerors' journals, in decaying missionary letters, and in the sudden silence of entire civilizations. It remains a biological enigma, the deadliest pandemic event in human history, yet still unnamed and only partially understood. A pandemic that reshaped continents not with fire or steel, but with fever, breathlessness, and silence. The English sweating sickness. In the summer of 1485, as England stood on the brink of a dynastic war, a more immediate threat crept silently into its cities. It began in the southern port of Dorset, spreading rapidly inland. Victims would feel a sudden chill, followed by intense sweating, panic, chest pain, and an overwhelming urge to lie down. Within hours, many were dead. It struck with such speed and violence that healthy men at breakfast were dead by supper. The English called it simply the sweating sickness. This illness struck 5 major times between 1485 and 1551. It was different from the plague, and it terrified people more than any other disease known in Tudor England. Unlike bubonic outbreaks, which lingered for months, the sweating sickness often wiped out entire communities in days. Nobles, scholars, and even royalty were not spared. In 1502, Prince Arthur, the eldest son of Henry VII, died suddenly. Some suspected it was the sweat. When the disease returned in 1528, it reached as far as Hamburg and northern Europe, but curiously it never touched southern France, Italy, or the Mediterranean. The symptoms were bizarre and uniquely English. Reports described an overwhelming sense of dread, cold shivers, dizziness, intense thirst, and chest tightness. Then came the profuse sweating, so intense that sheets and clothing were drenched in minutes. Victims often collapsed from exhaustion, and many died within 3 to 6 hours. Unlike plague or smallpox, there were no visible sores or rashes, no boils, no buboes, no external signs, just internal collapse. Some who survived the first 24 hours recovered fully. Most didn't. Even now, no one is certain what caused it. For centuries, theories included anthrax, hantavirus, ergot poisoning, and influenza variants. In recent decades, some researchers have linked it to a now extinct strain of hantavirus, possibly spread by rodents during the upheaval of England's War of the Roses. Others have suggested a tick-borne illness, or a disease related to modern-day Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever. But there is no genetic material left to test, no samples, just written records. The mysterious nature of the sweating sickness was compounded by its sudden disappearance. After its last major outbreak in 1551, the disease simply vanished. It never returned to England. No region on Earth has seen another outbreak of exactly the same symptoms. For a disease so deadly and widespread, its total extinction, without explanation, is as strange as its rapid arrival. Medical writers of the time, including Thomas Le Forestier and John Caius, documented the symptoms in detail, but even they admitted they were helpless to understand it. One physician described it as a new and unknown illness never before seen. Treatment attempts ranged from cooling the body with cold water to isolating the sick in stables and barns, away from towns. Some believed it spread through bad air, others through divine punishment. The only certainty was fear. The disease struck the highest levels of society. When the 1528 outbreak reached London, even King Henry VIII fled the city, moving court from palace to palace in search of safety. He lost several close advisors to the disease and began issuing orders remotely, paranoid that proximity meant death. It was perhaps the only force that made the Tudor king retreat. Yet perhaps the strangest aspect of all is how few people outside England remember it today. There are no monuments to the victims, no preserved towns or public rituals. Only scattered letters, burial records, and first-hand accounts remain. For a disease that could kill in a matter of hours, one might expect a more lasting mark on human history. Instead, it came, it killed, and it disappeared, leaving behind a gap in medical knowledge that has never been closed. The English sweating sickness remains one of the only major epidemic events in human history, with no confirmed cause, no surviving pathogen, and no clear origin. It remains a phantom, recorded, feared, and never seen again. What kind of disease burns through a nation, kills princes and peasants alike, and then fades from the earth without a trace? The Cyprian Plague. In the year 250 CE, as the Roman Empire struggled with political instability and border invasions, an even more devastating enemy emerged, one that ignored legions, fortresses, and walls. It began, according to early sources, in the region of Ethiopia. Within weeks, the disease swept through Egypt, then into North Africa and across the Mediterranean, ravaging Carthage, Rome, and far beyond. It was so relentless, so consuming, that even hardened Roman soldiers feared the heavens had turned against them. History remembers it as the Cyprian Plague. The name comes from Saint Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, who chronicled the disease in stark, almost apocalyptic terms. His descriptions, intended as a theological warning, have become vital clues for modern scholars. According to Cyprian, victims experienced severe diarrhea, continuous vomiting, loss of hearing, partial blindness, fever, and gangrenous limbs. The intestines are shaken with a continual vomiting, he wrote. The eyes are on fire with the infected blood, and in some cases, the feet or other limbs are taken off by the contagion. What made the Cyprian plague particularly horrifying was not just its symptoms, but its scale. At its peak, it reportedly killed up to 5,000 people per day in Rome alone. In an empire already fraying from internal conflict, civil war, and economic collapse, the plague amplified every weakness. Fields were left untended, towns abandoned, armies diminished. The Emperor Decius, who died in 251 CE, was among many who succumbed during this time, possibly a direct victim of the disease. The religious response was just as transformative. Pagan Romans interpreted the plague as punishment from the gods for neglecting old rites. Meanwhile, Christian communities, who tended to the sick regardless of belief, gained credibility, converts, and influence. Some historians argue that the Cyprian Plague was a pivotal moment in the Christianization of the Roman Empire. Faith replaced fear. In many places, altars were destroyed, and churches built where temples once stood. Yet the pathogen behind this ancient terror remains unknown. Was it smallpox, a hemorrhagic virus, perhaps even a form of viral encephalitis? The symptoms described, especially the bleeding eyes and progressive limb necrosis, have few direct analogues in modern diseases. Some scholars have speculated that it might have been a highly virulent strain of Ebola-like hemorrhagic fever. Others suspect multiple outbreaks of different illnesses overlapped, creating a broader perception of one single catastrophe. There is no known burial site or physical evidence tied directly to the Cyprian Plague. Unlike the Black Death, which left behind mass graves and plague pits, the Cyprian outbreak left more spiritual than archaeological residue. What survives are the words of those who lived through it, and those words are filled with dread. A particularly unsettling aspect of the plague's spread is its sheer distance. From Ethiopia to Britain, over thousands of miles and within just a few years, the disease moved faster than typical trade or military campaigns. Did it travel by caravan, by ship, or by vectors unknown? Roman records offer few logistics, only the growing lists of the dead. Even the conclusion of the plague is unclear. Some reports suggest it lingered until around 270 CE, slowly burning out across the empire. But in many regions, it seemed to vanish suddenly, as if retreating into the shadows. Unlike other epidemics of the time, it left no clear immunological legacy, no recorded immunity, no resistance, no preparation for future waves. And yet, its impact reshaped an empire. It weakened Roman borders, empowered Christianity, destabilized civil governance, and accelerated the transformation of one of history's most enduring civilizations. The Cyprian Plague was more than a medical mystery. It was a catalyst, a silent architect behind the crumbling of an empire. The Cocoliztli Epidemics. In the year 1545, high in the central valleys of New Spain, what is now Mexico, an invisible enemy began to spread through the indigenous populations. Entire villages fell silent. People died within days of the first symptoms, often before they could even speak of what ailed them. The locals called it Cocoliztli, a Nahuatl word meaning great pestilence. But what it truly was has never been determined. The first major wave of this unknown illness killed between 5 and 15 million people, up to 80% of the remaining native population. Then, in 1576, it struck again, killing millions more. These two outbreaks were among the deadliest pandemics in human history, and yet today, most people have never heard of them. Eyewitness accounts from Spanish missionaries and physicians paint a picture of a terrifying affliction. Victims developed high fevers, severe headaches, chest and abdominal pain, and intense thirst. Within hours, they began bleeding from the eyes, nose, and mouth. In many cases, the skin turned yellow and the tongue black. Death often came within 3 to 4 days. Unlike European diseases such as smallpox or measles, this sickness seemed uniquely devastating to the indigenous population, yet left Spanish settlers largely unharmed. Modern researchers have attempted to identify the pathogen behind Cocoliztli using forensic analysis of skeletal remains from known burial sites. One study published in 2018 suggested the presence of Salmonella enterica, a bacterium associated with typhoid fever, but the symptoms described in 16th century reports do not match modern typhoid. Others have proposed hemorrhagic fevers, perhaps a virus native to the Americas that has since gone extinct. There is even a theory that it was a previously unrecorded zoonotic disease, passed from wild animals to humans under extreme environmental stress. At the time of the first outbreak, central Mexico was suffering from a prolonged mega-drought. The famine that followed would have weakened immune systems across the region. Malnourishment, combined with the collapse of traditional food and water systems under colonial disruption, may have made indigenous communities especially vulnerable to an otherwise survivable pathogen. But the scale of death remains staggering. The physical remnants of Cocoliztli are few. Burials were often rushed, and in many cases, mass graves were dug without ceremony. At Tepozcolula Yucunda, a Mixtec site in Oaxaca, archaeologists uncovered hundreds of skeletons piled into a single churchyard, all dated to the outbreak period. There were no signs of trauma, no war, no famine, only disease. Perhaps most disturbing is the way this epidemic seemed to vanish after the 16th century. There have been no confirmed cases since. No known strain of virus or bacterium has ever matched its full symptom profile. In epidemiology, extinction of a pathogen. This deadly is rare. Usually diseases persist, mutate, or re-emerge. Cocoliztli simply disappeared. Its legacy, however, did not. The epidemics contributed directly to the collapse of indigenous societies. With entire generations wiped out, oral histories were lost, traditions severed, and political structures dissolved. Spanish rule expanded unchallenged into regions that had once fiercely resisted. The demographic shift was so great that the very landscape of Mexico changed. Abandoned farmland returned to forest, cities shrank, and ancient temples were swallowed by overgrowth. Some historians now argue that Cocoliztli, not conquest, was the true agent of colonization in the Americas. Steel and horses may have opened the gates, but disease made resistance impossible. And yet, this was not a European disease, at least not one anyone can confirm. Cocoliztli remains an unclassified biological event, a ghost plague that left no samples and no survivors. A disease that killed millions, shaped a continent, and then vanished, leaving only bones and questions. The Plague of Justinian. In the year 541 CE, the Byzantine Empire stood at its zenith. Under Emperor Justinian I, its territory stretched from the deserts of North Africa to the highlands of Armenia. Constantinople gleamed with golden domes and marble forums. Then, without warning, death arrived. It crept in from the docks into the alleys and markets, and soon into the imperial palace itself. Within weeks, tens of thousands were dead. The empire would never fully recover. Known today as the Plague of Justinian, this was the first historically recorded pandemic of bubonic plague. It began in the port city of Pelusium in Egypt and rapidly spread northward through trade routes into the heart of the Byzantine world. By the time it reached Constantinople, the city was unprepared for the scale of what was coming. Contemporary accounts are both vivid and haunting. The historian Procopius wrote that bodies were piled in open courtyards, sometimes 30 or 40 high, and that so many died each day that burial became impossible. Emperor Justinian himself fell ill, though he ultimately survived. At the peak of the outbreak, estimates suggest up to 10,000 people died per day in the capital alone. Between 541 and 542 CE, the plague is believed to have killed between 25 and 50 million people across the Mediterranean basin, possibly 40% of the empire's population. The symptoms were brutal. Victims developed high fevers, vomiting, and swollen buboes, painful lumps under the arms, neck, or groin that oozed black fluid. Many died within days. Some fell into delirium, speaking in tongues before death. In some cases, the disease attacked the lungs, spreading through cough and breath, what we now understand as pneumonic plague. Despite its similarities to the Black Death of the 14th century, the Justinian plague remains a unique event. Genetic analysis of ancient DNA recovered from 6th century plague pits confirms the presence of Yersinia pestis. But, as with later pandemics, the exact strain behaved with unusual aggression. Unlike modern outbreaks, which are generally limited in scope, this pandemic struck repeatedly in waves for nearly 2 centuries. Every few decades, it returned, sometimes less intense, sometimes catastrophic. The societal impact was devastating. The Byzantine economy collapsed as tax revenue dried up and trade halted. Armies shrank. Justinian's dream of reconquering the Western Roman Empire faltered. As farmers died and fields went unplowed, famine followed disease. Religious fervor surged, with apocalyptic sermons spreading panic as fast as the illness. In some regions, pagan rituals were revived in a desperate plea for divine mercy. But what continues to puzzle modern epidemiologists is how the disease spread with such terrifying speed. The logistics of ancient transportation could hardly explain the simultaneous outbreaks from Syria to Spain within months. Some researchers propose climate events, such as the sudden volcanic eruption in 536 CE that triggered a global cooling period, may have shifted rodent and flea populations across Eurasia. Others question whether additional, unknown factors accelerated transmission, including human-to-human vectors that evolved temporarily and then disappeared. Another mystery lies in the psychological aftermath. Unlike later pandemics, the Plague of Justinian seems to have faded from popular memory. It is barely mentioned in medieval European texts, as if a veil of forgetfulness descended after the final wave. Yet its consequences were long-lasting. The weakened empire became vulnerable to new enemies, including the rapidly expanding Islamic Caliphate. In this sense, the plague may have indirectly reshaped the political and religious map of the entire Mediterranean. Though largely absent from popular history, the Plague of Justinian was one of humanity's deadliest biological events. It ended a golden age, stunted a civilization, and redefined the limits of imperial power, not by war, but by infection. It came from the grain ships, rose with the tides, and left a silence no emperor could command. The Plague of Athens. In the second year of the Peloponnesian War, 430 BCE, as Sparta laid siege to Athens, a silent adversary infiltrated the city walls. It struck without warning, ignoring generals and walls, strategies, and treaties. Within weeks, it decimated the Athenian population, shifting the course of the war and shattering the very foundations of the world's most celebrated democracy. History records it simply as the Plague of Athens. The only detailed contemporary account comes from Thucydides, the Athenian historian and general who not only witnessed the plague firsthand, but survived it. His writing provides one of the earliest medical descriptions of an epidemic in Western history. He recounted how it began in the port of Piraeus, the city's primary gateway for food and supplies, and spread rapidly into the overcrowded urban center, where citizens had gathered to escape Spartan attacks on the countryside. The symptoms were cruel and relentless. Victims first suffered from high fever, red and inflamed eyes, bleeding tongues, and sore throats that prevented speech. This was followed by uncontrollable sneezing, coughing, and vomiting. Many experienced violent convulsions, unquenchable thirst, and in later stages, gangrene of the extremities. Some lost memory, others eyesight. The stench of death filled the air, and wild dogs fed on the dead, spreading fear and disease further. Athens, once the cultural and intellectual beacon of the ancient world, fell into chaos. The sick were abandoned in the streets. Religious customs were cast aside. Funeral rites were neglected. Citizens, fearing the gods had forsaken them, turned to desperation and lawlessness. According to Thucydides, no fear of God or law of man had any restraining influence. Social bonds dissolved under the weight of death. The mortality rate was staggering. Modern estimates suggest up to 100,000 people may have died, roughly a quarter of Athens' population at the time. Among the dead was Pericles, the city's famed leader and architect of its golden age. His death left Athens politically weakened and emotionally broken. Many historians believe the plague played a decisive role in Athens' eventual defeat by Sparta, altering the trajectory of Greek history. But what exactly was the disease? For centuries, scholars have debated its identity. Theories include typhus, typhoid fever, smallpox, measles, and even viral hemorrhagic fever. In 2006, a team of Greek scientists analyzed dental pulp from a mass grave discovered in Athens, believed to contain plague victims. The DNA evidence pointed towards Salmonella enterica cerevar typhi, the bacterium responsible for typhoid fever. But the match was inconclusive, and many symptoms described by Thucydides do not align with modern typhoid. Some have proposed more exotic explanations, including anthrax or an unknown zoonotic virus that has since vanished. The lack of consistency in symptoms, coupled with the extremely high mortality rate and the psychological effects recorded, suggests a complex pathogen, or possibly multiple diseases erupting simultaneously under conditions of war, overcrowding, and famine. No pathogen has been definitively identified. No remains of the disease survive in a laboratory. What does remain is the historical impact. The Plague of Athens marks one of the earliest known instances of a disease changing the fate of a civilization. It halted democratic progress, shattered philosophical optimism, and ushered in an era of instability and defeat. Socrates, Plato's teacher, would later live in a city marked by disillusionment, shaped in part by a plague that had robbed Athens of its ideals and many of its leaders. And like so many ancient diseases, the Plague of Athens disappeared as suddenly as it came. No recurrence was ever recorded. It burned through the population, claimed the best and worst alike, and then faded into history, leaving behind not just bodies, but a wounded civilization and a mystery that endures. A war may have brought Sparta to the gates, but it was something unseen that brought Athens to its knees. The Antonine Plague, in 165 CE, as Roman legions returned victorious from campaigns in the east, they carried with them not only spoils of war, but something far more lethal, an invisible passenger that would soon engulf the empire. Within months, reports of widespread illness began to surface from Syria to Gaul. Soldiers fell first, then merchants, then entire cities. The empire's infrastructure, thought to be invincible, began to crack. This was the beginning of the Antonine Plague. The name derives from the ruling dynasty of the time, the Antonines, and more specifically from Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-king who would spend much of his reign managing the consequences of this disaster. The primary account of the plague comes from Galen, the most renowned physician of antiquity, who treated patients and documented symptoms during his travels through Asia Minor and Italy. According to Galen, the disease produced fever, diarrhea, skin eruptions, and, most notably, black scabs that covered the body. Victims who survived the initial fever often succumbed to secondary infections. The duration of the illness ranged from several days to weeks, and reinfection was rare, suggesting lasting immunity among survivors. Modern historians widely believe the Antonine Plague was an outbreak of smallpox, introduced to the Roman world from campaigns in Mesopotamia. Its spread was relentless. The disease swept through military camps, port cities, and trade hubs, exploiting the very networks that made Rome powerful. Mortality estimates range from 5 to 10 million people over a span of 15 years. In some provinces, up to a third of the population may have died. The Roman army, already stretched thin, suffered devastating losses. Recruitment faltered, frontier defenses weakened, internal unrest flared. The psychological toll was just as severe. As cities emptied and pyres burned day and night, traditional Roman beliefs were shaken. Old gods were seen as impotent, while mystery cults and new religious movements gained momentum. The cult of Mithras and the teachings of early Christianity both found fertile ground in a society seeking spiritual stability amidst physical collapse. Emperor Marcus Aurelius, known for his Stoic writings, continued to lead during this catastrophe. In his personal journals, later compiled as Meditations, he reflected on mortality, duty, and the fragility of power. He eventually succumbed to illness in 180 CE during a military campaign on the Danube frontier. Though unconfirmed, many believe the plague claimed his life. His death marked the end of Pax Romana, the 2-century period of relative peace and prosperity, and the beginning of the empire's slow unraveling. The Antonine Plague reveals a stark truth. Even the most advanced civilizations can be undone not by war or rebellion, but by disease. For all its aqueducts, roads, and legions, Rome could not defend itself against a microscopic threat. The empire's bureaucratic machinery ground to a halt. Census counts were delayed. Tax revenues plummeted. Entire towns disappeared from records. What is most haunting is the pattern that would repeat itself centuries later with other pandemics. Sudden emergence, rapid spread through globalized networks, medical helplessness, and societal transformation. The Antonine Plague was not just a health crisis. It was a pivot point. Rome survived, but it emerged changed, weaker, more fragmented, and more vulnerable to future shocks. Modern DNA studies have yet to isolate physical traces of this outbreak, leaving us with only the accounts of Galen and the consequences etched into Roman history. No virus has been preserved, no burial pits excavated with confirmed victims. Like so many ancient plagues, it lives in the margins, devastating yet elusive. A single illness, likely carried by a soldier returning from the east, shook the greatest empire of its time to its core, and for a brief moment, even the eternal city remembered it was mortal. The Plague of Amwas. In the year 639 CE, during the early expansion of the Rashidun Caliphate, a deadly epidemic struck the Levant. It began in the town of Amwas, in present-day Palestine, and spread rapidly through the ranks of the Muslim army stationed there. Among the dead were some of the Prophet Muhammad's most trusted companions. Though often overshadowed by more famous plagues, the Plague of Amwas holds a unique place in history, as a moment when faith, war, and disease collided on sacred ground. The earliest Islamic sources describe the plague in detail. Accounts from historians such as al-Tabari and Ibn al-Athir note that it caused intense fever, internal bleeding, and sudden death. One observer wrote that it consumed the soldiers like fire consumes wood. Over 25,000 people are believed to have died in this single outbreak, including Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, commander of the Muslim forces in Syria, and one of the 10 companions promised paradise. What makes the Plague of Amwas historically significant is not only its timing, but its political consequences. The Rashidun army, which had recently conquered vast territories from the Byzantine Empire, was forced to halt its advance. Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab reportedly refused to enter the affected region, citing the Prophet's instruction not to enter or flee a land afflicted by plague. This decision reflected a blend of religious principle and early public health logic, centuries before modern epidemiology. In response to the crisis, Umar appointed new commanders as successive leaders fell ill. One after another, high-ranking officers succumbed to the disease, leaving gaps in leadership that would shift the course of Islamic governance. The plague effectively decapitated the military elite in Syria, prompting reorganization and reshuffling of power within the early Islamic State. These changes had ripple effects for generations. Unlike many ancient plagues, the cause of the Amwas outbreak is relatively well understood. Modern historians believe it was likely a form of bubonic plague caused by Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium responsible for the later Black Death. The symptoms described, including swollen lymph nodes and rapid mortality, support this theory. However, genetic material has not been recovered, and no mass burial sites have been definitively linked to this event. Religious narratives surrounding the plague added further layers of interpretation. While some viewed it as divine punishment, others saw it as a test or even a form of martyrdom. In Islamic tradition, those who die in plague are granted the same spiritual status as those killed in battle. This perception softened the terror of the disease, allowing communities to endure with a sense of purpose and sacred meaning. Still, the scale of loss was profound. In some areas, whole tribes lost their male leaders. Oral traditions speak of families buried together in shallow graves under the midday sun, with funeral rites performed in silence. The once thriving town of Amwas was so devastated that it faded from prominence, its historical footprint reduced to little more than ruins and memory. The Plague of Amwas stands as one of the earliest well-documented pandemics in Islamic history. It demonstrated the vulnerabilities of a rapidly expanding empire, even one driven by fervent faith and military success. It also revealed the fragility of leadership in the face of disease, and the ways in which illness, more than swords or treaties, could redraw the political map. Though largely forgotten outside academic circles, the Amwas epidemic remains a potent reminder that even spiritual conviction and military strength offer little defense against biological catastrophe. A plague that altered the course of Islamic expansion, not through battle or betrayal, but through breath and blood. The Plague of Emmaus. Later, in 639 CE, in the same year as the outbreak in Amwas, another wave of disease struck the region, this time centered around the town of Emmaus, just miles from Jerusalem. Though often conflated with the Plague of Amwas due to overlapping geography and chronology, many historical sources treat Emmaus as a separate epicenter, marked by its own patterns of devastation and spiritual consequence. This secondary outbreak deepened the crisis facing the Rashidun Caliphate and cemented 639 as a year of unparalleled mortality in the early Islamic world. Emmaus, a town with roots stretching back to Roman and even biblical times, became a place of death rather than healing. Historical accounts describe how the disease erupted among troops stationed in the area, spreading rapidly through encampments and civilian populations alike. Soldiers reported fevers that struck like lightning. One moment a man stood at prayer, the next he fell dead. Swelling in the neck and groin, intense delirium, and bleeding from the mouth were among the common symptoms. Unlike the more isolated outbreaks seen in earlier plagues, this event unfolded in a region already destabilized by conquest, migration, and climate stress. The eastern Mediterranean had just experienced a series of droughts and crop failures, and the increased movement of troops, livestock, and goods had likely created the perfect conditions for a pathogen to thrive. Contemporary Islamic scholars wrote about the plague not only as a public health event, but also as a spiritual trial. Some described it as a divine filter, separating the faithful from the unworthy. Others warned that the presence of the disease in sacred lands near Jerusalem indicated a coming reckoning. These interpretations, while theological, shaped the way communities responded, with fatalism, devotion, and in some cases, mass withdrawal from urban centers. The scale of the Emmaus outbreak remains difficult to quantify due to the overlap with Amwas. However, several sources suggest that this secondary epicenter triggered a larger exodus from central Palestine. Reports from the time describe caravans of survivors, sick, grieving, and exhausted, moving south toward the Hijaz and Egypt, hoping to escape the contagion. Many died along the road, their bodies left where they fell. As with the Amwas outbreak, modern historians believe the cause was likely a strain of Yersinia pestis. But the behavior of the disease in Emmaus raises questions. Some observers noted that the death rate in Emmaus seemed even higher than in surrounding areas. The afflicted often perished within a single day. In one documented case, an entire company of soldiers stationed near the town was wiped out in less than a week, without ever encountering enemy forces. The aftershocks of the Emmaus outbreak extended far beyond the battlefield. The reorganization of military command following the death of several key generals led to new power dynamics within the Rashidun leadership. It also delayed planned campaigns into Anatolia and North Africa. Religious scholars and poets later referenced 639 as the Year of Ashes, not because of fire, but because of how quickly entire lineages were extinguished. What is perhaps most unsettling is that after this dual-wave event, Amwas and Emmaus, the plague disappeared from the region for decades. No major outbreaks were recorded in the Levant until the return of the Black Death nearly 700 years later. The disease burned fast and bright, then retreated into the shadows. Today, Emmaus exists more in memory than in stone. Its ancient ruins, scattered and partially excavated, bear no obvious signs of the tragedy that unfolded there. There are no monuments to the fallen soldiers or grieving families. Only the silence remains, a silence that once followed the tolling of prayers, the shouts of commanders, and the final cries of the dying. The Plague of Emmaus was not just an echo of Amwas. It was a separate chord in a funeral song that no empire could escape. Conclusion. The 10 plagues described in this investigation are not isolated disasters buried beneath the dust of ancient history. Together, they reveal a troubling and recurring pattern, one that crosses empires, religions, and centuries. These were not simply outbreaks of disease. They were world-altering events that reshaped the trajectory of civilizations, toppled rulers, rewrote belief systems, and erased entire cultures. What binds them is not just their scale, but the lasting silence they left in their wake. Each pandemic struck at the height of perceived human control. The Athenians believed in reason, the Byzantines in divine order, the Romans in military strength, the Aztecs in celestial cycles. Yet, in each case, a force beyond understanding brought their systems to the edge of collapse. The Black Death unraveled Europe's social contract. The Antonine and Justinian plagues cracked the foundations of Rome. Cocoliztli erased civilizations with no surviving voice. The sweating sickness appeared, killed, and vanished, leaving behind only questions. A disturbing pattern emerges. Pandemics have not only shaped history, but have done so through mechanisms that remain, even today, poorly understood. Several of these ancient diseases do not match any known pathogen. Others reappear in different forms across centuries, behaving unpredictably. Some vanish completely, as if their purpose had been fulfilled. Modern science has made astonishing progress, yet even with genetic sequencing and epidemiological models, many of these plagues resist full explanation. These are not just medical mysteries. They are events that expose the fragility of power and the illusion of control. No army, no temple, no dynasty could withstand the invisible. The sweeping consequences, religious upheaval, economic resets, migration waves, political implosions, suggest that pandemics have not merely accompanied history, but have directed it. And perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: we may only be aware of the ones that left written traces. In regions without chroniclers, in languages now lost, how many pandemics passed unnoticed by history? Except in the disappearance of a people, the abandonment of a city, the sudden stillness of once vibrant land, the threat did not end with these 10. What we call ancient may be cyclical. Strains dormant in the ice, viruses trapped in jungles, or pathogens evolving silently may yet awaken in our time. The tools have improved, but the pattern persists. If there is a lesson in these forgotten plagues, it is this: the deadliest forces in history are not always the loudest. Sometimes they arrive quietly, with a fever, a cough, a silence.